From the top. Today, I am really excited to share with you a fascinating piece of Canadian history. Probably a piece of Canadian history you don't know, that you're not familiar with. Um, I had the privilege to sit down with a guy by the name of Ron Foss. Ron's grandfather, George Foote Foss, was the inventor of Canada's first internal combustion engine vehicle. George built his machine. It didn't really have a name. It's been sort of dubbed the Fossmobile since, about 6 months before Henry Ford built the quadricycle. It's a really interesting story. And to honor his grandfather's invention, Ron set out to build a replica of the original Fossmobile. Let's take a listen to how my conversation with Ron went. Ron, where am I reaching you today?
I'm in Burlington, Ontario.
Burlington. Have you always lived in the Burlington area? Or is this
No, actually, I grew up in a little town called Fort Chambly, south of Montreal. Started my career pretty much in Montreal and then moved to Toronto. I've been in Ottawa, bounced around a little bit.
Got it. And your family is originally from Sherbrooke, right? That's where your
My
grandfather?
grandfather was originally from Sherbrooke. Yeah, the family actually migrated up through the U.S. They were part of the initial, the Foss name was part of the initial pilgrimage into the Eastern Seaboard, Eastern states, came up through Pennsylvania, and then a few of them came up through Quebec into Sherbrooke, ultimately then Montreal.
I mean, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm my own family. I make the joke that I'm a family of criminals, that all of my family went to places they couldn't be followed. So they hid in Canada, Alaska, and then ended up in Australia because, prison island, all that jazz. But as I say, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but your grandfather and his invention, I mean, very impressive, but also a weird glaring hole in Canadian automotive history, maybe just history in general. Talk to me about the origins of the Fossmobile. How did this happen? How did this come about?
Well, it's a fairly interesting story. He was only about 19 or 20 at the time, had started up a business, bicycle repair type business in a small shop that he acquired and did a bunch of things that were fairly innovative at the time, like harness the Magog River in Sherbrooke to allow to run some of his equipment and machinery in the shop. He then created a generator that allowed him to have electricity in the shop. A lot of firsts in that regard. But he used to go down to Boston quite frequently. The train from Boston, Grand Trunk Railway down to Boston was fairly easily accessible to buy new equipment, new parts, things that he needed to enhance the shop, because it slowly migrated from a bicycle repair shop into a machine shop. And while he was there, he noticed that you could rent an electric automobile for a few dollars, a couple dollars, and he was guaranteed, 2 or 3 hour operating time. And I don't think the last thing lasted more than 20 minutes, which he knew about or wasn't surprised about, because he had already invented an outboard electric motor for his boat, which he ran up and down the St. Francis River in Sherbrooke. And he always had battery problems, dying, earlier, and having to row back to shore and things like that. So driving the automobile and finding out that the batteries didn't last was of no surprise. So on the train ride home, he began to think about, if the automobile is something of the future, then maybe a combustion engine is the better way to go.
It's so fascinating to me because I think most people don't know the automotive history, that there were so many battery electric vehicles on the road in those days in the late 1890s, or that was a thing, but that was actually the dominant mode of transportation for a lot of cities.
Well, in fact, it all started with steam. I mean, the
Right.
very first cars were steam, and the first Canadian car built in Canada is a steam car in 1867 by Henry Seth Taylor in Stansted, Quebec, not far from Sherbrooke. And so, steam kind of started it all off, but batteries became a more reliable way of going, because heating up a boiler You think cold starting an engine and having to wait for a few minutes before taking off. Think about firing up a boiler, waiting the half hour it would take to get enough steam. But anyway, steam started in the locomotives. It went to the automobile. Then came the batteries, but the batteries weren't reliable. And so combustion engine became the way to go.
So what do we know? So your grandfather, George Foote Foss, did you know him? Did you meet him? What do we know about your grandfather?
Yeah, very well, actually. I mean, I grew up in this little town called Fossmobile, south of Montreal. He had moved to Montreal in, I think, 1901 and, raised his family there. And so we never lived that far away from them. Would visit every second Sunday or something, and have dinner or lunch with them. And he was a very, very quiet, very subdued individual, low key with respect to everything he did. I don't ever remember him getting terribly excited about grandchildren or anything. His wife, on the other hand, was thrilled, but he was always very just, quiet. Now, by this time, he was well into his 80s, so not surprising, perhaps. But yeah, I met him many times. I mean, one of the things I joke about is I really wished, given what I've undertaken to do, that I'd asked him some better questions along the way.
Right.
Because it's sort of a bit of a kick in the rear for us as a family to not have better documented what he actually did.
I mean, I had this question later, but it is kind of and again, I do feel like I'm getting ahead of myself, but is there a bit of a what if around the dinner table when your family talks about this, when this story comes up?
Yeah, lots of them. I mean, from the time I was little, he had the opportunity to partner with Henry Ford. They met on 2 occasions, and in both situations, Ford tried to convince my grandfather that the automobile was the way of the future, and perhaps he should consider investing in a company that Ford was contemplating, which at the time hadn't yet been developed. But Ford had built his first automobile called the quadricycle, and knew that George had built his, and so they talked a few times. But he didn't have the insight to think that, that automobiles were of the future. And so turned it down. So, we used to talk about, well, had he joined Ford, we might be a completely different family in relation to status, right?
Indeed. Well,
but my grandfather, I will tell you, had absolutely no regrets. He actually didn't like the person, Henry Ford, thought he was not the kind of person he'd want to go into business with. But my grandfather was always also very risk reserved, or didn't like the risk side of things. Again, keeping things really simple. Everything was a cash business. The notion of building automobiles. I get people to think back in time a little bit. You got to sort of go back to that point in time. What was it like? Well, there were no other vehicles on the road. The streets were muddy and rutty. In some cases, he used to tell us that some people used to think he was demonized in some way. Like, what's this thing running up and down the street with no horse in front of it? And it made noise, and got stuck in the mud, and all those early automotive stories he certainly experienced, and it didn't give him any insight that the automobile was going to become the thing of the future.
It's kind of wild when you phrase it like that. The carriage without a horse in front of it is like the autonomous vehicle of today, a car with no driver in it. It's right. It's taken us 100 years to get there again, but we're experiencing a very similar kind of technological shift there. Why? So you think, so George Foote Foss, he's working on this, he goes to Boston, he goes for a ride in this electric car, he comes back and he builds his own vehicle. He builds his own horseless carriage, his own gas-powered car in the same year that Ford builds the quadricycle, right? Basically, it's like they're working in parallel, and they become aware of each other, but they're not at all working together. It's just sort of like at the same time, they're working on a very similar project, very similar initiative.
Yeah, the awareness came only after the fact. So they both had successfully accomplished what they set out to do. Ford with the quadricycle, Foss with the Fossmobile, which, by the way, only became the Fossmobile much later on. It didn't have a name in its early days.
Well, I was going to say, did he have a name for it? Did he call it? He didn't.
Not that I'm aware of.
No. What was it to him? Mhm.
That's his, I don't know, his automobile, I guess. I don't know. His horseless carriage. I mean,
His
that's what they
horseless
called them
carriage.
those days.
Right. And he chooses not to invest in Ford. He has also offered money to potentially, commercialize this vehicle, replicate the vehicle, and declines that. You
There was a
explain.
local banker in town who liked what he saw. I mean, George was using it for 3 or 4 years in the Sherbrooke area, and if you know Sherbrooke, it's a pretty hilly, city, and he had no difficulty getting around any part of the city that he chose to. And so the banker offered him, some financing to, in fact, build more than the one. But again, that was a credit issue. He didn't like credit. He didn't like the risk with that. He didn't like the fact that this might be an investment that doesn't pay off. People may not buy automobiles. Horseless carriages are still the way to go. Sorry, horse-drawn carriages are the way to go.
Horse-drawn carriages. But then he ends up, so he's working in his machine shop, and then he becomes a car dealer of an era of the sort.
Yes, that's right. So after building the car, there's a couple of things that sort of happen simultaneously, and we don't have a lot of really good documentation around all of it, but there is a sense that he had multiple conversations with the people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is not far from Boston, about building cars. And lo and behold, the Crestmobile company is formed in I think 1899, and their first vehicle comes out in 1900 or 1901. I'm not sure which date, and it looks identical to the Fossmobile with a couple of very minor exceptions. And so, then when he moves to Montreal in 1901, he becomes the distributor for Crestmobile. So you have to ask the question, like, why did he become the distributor for Crestmobile from Cambridge, Massachusetts, if he didn't have some sort of involvement with the fellows who developed the company and decided to build automobiles commercially? And again, when you look at the 1901, which we did when we built the Tribute and the replica, we went down to Cambridge, where there's one in a museum down there, and studied it, every bolt, every nook and cranny, every measurement, everything. We could photograph it, about 1,000 photographs, so that we could use it against our old photographs to build the replica Tribute card that we did. And so that's why he became a distributor, because we think he had enough of a relationship with them that he either unknowingly, just in general chit chat, shared some of his building secrets, or because he didn't want to build cars commercially, said, if you guys want to go ahead, this is how I did mine.
Hmm.
We never know the answer to that.
Right. But it seems like there's some Fossmobile DNA in the Crestmobile.
There's no question. Yeah, no question. I mean, the only difference, Matthew, is in the front of the Fossmobile, there's a wood cowling. That's what we call it. That has some vents in it that protects the engine, probably from rain and water and mud and whatever else. And I'll get back to that cowling in a few minutes regarding how the different parts were made. But the Crestmobile doesn't have that cowling. And the reason being is, in both situations, the engine had to get air. They were air-cooled engines. And so the cowling was somewhat preventative at getting air to the engine. So Crestmobile presumably decided it wasn't necessary to cover the engine. But every other aspect, and the only other small difference is the chain setup. So the chain is set up in the Fossmobile, has a single chain running from the engine to what's called the jack shaft in the center of the vehicle that has double sprockets on it, and then a third sprocket that runs to the rear differential. Crestmobile chose to run two chains off the separate two sprockets on the jack shaft to two separate sprockets on the differential to give you your two speeds. But other than that, it's almost identical.
And so while selling the Crestmobile, he ends up selling one to another automotive magnate of a sort.
You're close, not quite. Yeah. So his dealership handled multi-brands,
okay,
including ultimately Ford, by the way. But initially, Crestmobile was one, Stanley Steamer was another. And I think what you're referencing is Sam McLaughlin, Colonel Sam McLaughlin, whose father and he were building carriages in Ontario, and took a liking to automobiles, went down to Montreal and met with George. George taught him how to drive and ultimately sold him a Stanley Steamer. So So Sam's first car was a Stanley Steamer that came from my grandfather's dealership.
And then he goes on to create McLaughlin Motors and sells that to GM.
Yeah, it becomes General Motors. That's right. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, General Motors Canada. So if you're talking about partnerships, and where there might be some family disappointment and some discussions around the table, as you mentioned earlier, one of them is, perhaps the better person to have partnered with would have been Sam, because Sam was a much easier person to get along with, and what you read in the history books than potentially Henry Ford may have been. So my grandfather didn't even see that as an opportunity, but perhaps unfortunate, because Sam obviously built a very successful business.
So only one was made.
Only the one car was made. That's right.
And what became of this vehicle?
Well, there's a couple of interesting stories there. So because he was running the dealership and had other vehicles he could use, he seldom used the Fossmobile. So this is now 1901, 02, and he decided to sell it. So he listed it for, I think, $300 originally. And a fellow comes down from Ottawa thinking he might buy it, and gets into the cockpit, and everything was controlled in the cockpit. You could start it from the cockpit. You could set the spark advance in the cockpit. You had your steering and your throttle and your gear shifting all in the cockpit. So the fellow climbs up in the cockpit. My grandfather explains to him how you prime the engine and how you pull the leather strap with a good hard pull, and the engine should start. So this fellow gives a pull on the strap, but he didn't pull it very hard, and it kicked back and flung them over the top of the cowling and onto the ground. And lo and behold, the fellow has a wooden leg, which is now all twisted and broken, and a torn pair of pants. And he gets up and kind of reorganizes himself a little bit and says, "This thing's a menace and a demon. I don't want it." So it sat in the dealership for another few months, perhaps almost a year, and then he sold it to a Montrealer for $75.
$75.
And it's never been seen since. And we've put out, obviously, my father and I used to travel around different parts of the eastern townships and even around Montreal and South Shore, thinking that maybe we could find it in somebody's barn or garage or, whatever. It's never turned up. With all the publicity that we've had at getting this story retold over the last 3 or 4 years, I think by now, if somebody did have it, it would have surfaced. And I can tell you an interesting side story to that. In the early 1960s, 1960, 61, he received 2 honorary memberships, one from the Antique Automobile Club of Montreal and one from the Antique Automobile Club of America, which is the most prestigious, still active club today. And he and Sam McLaughlin are the only 2 people to have ever received the American Award, which is a nice tribute. But I've had in my possession for years the original certificate from the Montreal Club, but we didn't have the American one. It somehow had disappeared. Well, pedal back to 1973, and there was a group of people who produced a book called Cars of Canada. And one of the authors of that book was Hugh Durnford, who also happened to be the president of the Vintage Automobile Club in Montreal. And so they met with my grandfather on a couple of occasions. In fact, I was present during some of those interviews. And they must have borrowed some of the old photographs and the certificate potentially to copy and put into the book. Well, the photographs made it into the book, but the certificate never did. And when I started Fossmobile Enterprises and started up some social media groups, I get this email from this fellow in Montreal and says, I used to work for the Vintage Automobile Club of Montreal. I think I have that certificate you're talking about.
Amazing.
So he goes down to his basement. He pulls out the certificate from an old filing cabinet that had been part of the Vintage Automobile Club of Montreal's. It's still an existing club, but they'd given up their offices and stuff. So he had seen the certificate on the desk and knew it might be valuable and put it into this filing cabinet, remembered that, and he had the filing cabinet in his basement. So he asked me, he said, "Do you want it back?" And I said, "Yes, absolutely." So we were able to get the original certificate back. Now, all of those items, all of the family heirlooms, anything related to George Foss or the Fossmobile, have all been donated to Library and Archives Canada. So I got some professional copies made. We had some framings of it done, but the actual originals are on view for the Canadian public to access through the through Archives Canada.
So you create this, is it a company, organization, Fossmobile Enterprises? What's the motivation here? So why, it's the vehicle is gone, the history is long since over. What is driving you to go ahead and build the replica?
Well, I think, I grew up with the story. I mean, from the time I was a toddler, I can remember, the Fossmobile being talked about at various dinners or round table or family gatherings or whatever. The awarding of those two certificates, renewed that interest. And I was, I don't know, 7, 8, or 9 or something at the time when he was given those. And so, and every grandchild and great grandchild and whatever family tree looks like have done school projects on the Fossmobile. It's always been in the back of my mind. Now, if I go back 5 years, I think it is, every now and then I would do searches on the internet to see if anybody might be talking about George Foss or the Fossmobile. And all of a sudden I hit on something where there was a couple of fellows in Brantford, Ontario, who were claiming they were going to build a replica of the Fossmobile. So I found it really strange that they hadn't reached out to any family members or anything. So I phoned them and said, like, what are you up to? And that went on for almost a year, I guess, where there was various discussions of what we might do, how we go about it, what was being undertaken. But slowly, the gap began to grow between what I felt was the right way to go and what they thought they wanted to do. To protect the Foss family, I trademarked Fossmobile, and I opened a company or started up a company called Fossmobile Enterprises. And that secured us as being able to have or maintain the rights around whatever the Fossmobile stood for. And they eventually, I then acquired a 1-cylinder, air-cooled, period-correct engine from the US. And that kind of put them at odds with me because now they thought I was leaping out in front of them, and we kind of decided we were going to part ways. They decided they would drop the initiative altogether. And that's what kind of spurred me on to say, okay, look, if my grandfather could do this 125 years ago with what's available to me today in relation to eBay for parts, the internet for information, resources and various experts in vintage and classic automobiles, and people who know actually how to build these kinds of things or restore these kinds of things were available to me. And so I just decided that the family and Canadians deserve to have this piece of automotive history better documented and better positioned for it to be appreciated in the future.
I think that's brilliant. I was actually thinking the byline for this recording should be something like, it's amazing what you can do with 4 horsepower. Like that there's a sort of it's amazing what you can do with only 4 horsepower. The motor itself is an interesting story, and that becomes a catalyst for you to move on. Where did that come from? And it wasn't just the motor. You also found some other things from the same source. Am I correct there? Is that accurate?
Yeah, it started as a ripple and turned into a tidal wave. So again, searching online, I was looking for this type of engine. I knew where George had gotten his ideas on how to build a combustion engine. And so I had a pretty good idea of what kind of engine it might look like. Because one of the things that was a downside for us is none of the photographs that we had showed an engine. It shows a larger water-cooled engine that he built in the shop after the fact, because he went on and built 10 other engines later on. None of them for an automobile, but for stationary purposes. And so I knew that design actually all came from de Dion. And de Dion was an engine manufacturer back in the mid to late 1800s. And they had agreements with manufacturers in the US under the issuing of rights to build the engines in the US. So the tariffs were too high to import the engines, but they sold the rights to build no name, no brand engines in the US, which were often used for either freestanding pumps or sawmills or whatever, but also tricycles. So motorcycle, tricycle type configurations was out before the automobile. And So I was searching for one of these engines. I was looking for, a de Dion type engine. And so I find one that's in pretty rough shape. And I contacted the fellow who happened to be in Florida. And we got talking about why I was looking for one and why he had it. And at first he didn't really want to part with it. But the more I told him our story, the more he got excited about the notion of what my goal was. And he's a real car enthusiast himself. He's done all sorts of projects himself. And so he said, look, I'll sell you the motor. I was going to restore it, but I haven't done it. I'll sell you the motor. So I bought the motor and got it up here and opened it up, and there's no piston in it. And I said, okay, this is a bit of a problem. So I wrote to him right away and said, thanks for the motor, but there's no piston. He says, oh, I think I have one on the shelf in my garage. And he said, it's a bit rusted, but I think it'll fit. So he sends up the piston, and when I first went to fit it, because of it being a bit rusted, it didn't fit. And I thought, I'm not an expert at any of this stuff. I'm a bit of a novice. So at first my reaction was, oh no, it's the wrong size. But I took it into a machine shop. We had it all honed down and cleaned up and said I could go, and it's perfect. Got new rings for it. And, the engine restoration was fairly simple, fairly easy. They're not complicated pieces of equipment. And so I restored the engine myself with some help with engine rebuilders to rehone and clean it up. And so we had the engine. And then, I was sending photographs back to this fellow saying, look at what your engine looks like now, and I started joking, sure you don't want it back? Here's my price. And he then said to me, he said, you're really making great advancements in this project. He says, I forgot to tell you, but I have this 1901 Locomobile chassis. Been in a fire. It's pretty rusted because it's been sitting outside for a couple of years. But I think it looks to me to be fairly similar from the pictures you sent me of what the original Fossmobile chassis looked like. He said, I'll send it up to you. So I said, okay. And so no charge, no cost to me. And so we started making arrangements on how we're going to get this thing shipped, which, the wheels don't function and roll. The spokes are all burned out of it. It's a bit collapsed in the center, but the supports have collapsed because of the heat. But I knew that if I couldn't use it, that I could replicate the parts from it. And so it became an important piece to me to think that we could shortchange or reduce the timeline in producing a new one. So we arranged through a very sophisticated automobile hauler to run down and pick up Florida cars, for the silver, what do they call them, silver foxes or whatever, that go down to Florida, Bentleys and whatever else. And
Right.
Would you mind picking up this piece and bringing it back for me? They said, absolutely, no charge. So they said, as long as you're willing to agree to our timeline, because I don't know when we're going to be in that particular area of Florida. I said, I'm in no rush. Go ahead. So 3 or 4 months later, this beautiful automobile hauler shows up on my street. He opens it up. He unloads a couple of Maseratis and a Ferrari and something else I can't remember. And up in the front of the truck and in the trailer is this rusted out piece of metal.
Kind of different from the other vehicles. He was
So the two of the cars were rolled off. One was white, one was black. And so by this time, the neighbors were gathering around. What's going on here? So I joked with them that I won the lottery, and it was a his and hers. But that was fairly short-lived as we started to drag off this chassis. That, as I said, couldn't roll. We kind of just had to drag it into my garage. And in the midst of all that, this same fellow calls me, I guess, just prior to the truck showing up. He said, I forgot to tell you, I also have a body. That's a wood body that is called a piano style body that, again, looks to be a fairly close match. He said, I'm going to toss that in with it. If the hauler doesn't mind bringing it up, I'm going to toss it in. So I acquired these two pieces of very period correct parts. And it turns out we took the chassis up to Legendary Motor Car up in Halton Hills. We dumped it into an acid bath to get the rust off of it. And it's cast iron, right? So it was solid. We had to add in two new lateral pieces to level it out again because they had warped. I took the wheels off and took them to a separate a motorcycle repair shop to get some new spokes and clean them up. But the thing with, the steering knuckles, the hubs, the axle, the differential, all completely identical to the Fossmobile from everything we could tell, other than an inch and a half. It was too long by an inch and a half. So we just reduced the size of the sidearms, and lo and behold, we had a chassis.
So you used that chassis. So
We
that
ended up
chassis.
using that chassis, number 153 of a locomobile. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It seems like you made a choice to pursue this, and then many pieces started coming together once you made the decision, okay, I'm all in on this project. The list of sponsors on your website for the Fossmobile is long and extensive. What did it take to put this vehicle together? When you think about that, talk about, the effort, the cost, the partnerships, the collaboration. What did it take to bring the George Foss's Fossmobile back to life?
Well, that's a good question, Matthew. Thank you. I think, when I originally took on the project, I committed to the fact that I was going to fund it. That as a family or as a member of the family, I could afford to fund this project. Little did I know at the time how much fabrication costs were going to be. And in fact, I can tell you right now, had I not been successful in doing some fundraising, it probably would have come to a screeching halt. But having acquired the engine, the chassis, the body, which all gave us running starts, it made the financial obligation a little easier to accept. And so that was the initial intent. But this project had multi aspects to it. It's project management 101, because not only did I have to, come up with the ideas of setting up the company and trademarking Fossmobile and then starting to acquire the parts, I then had to go out and find a bunch of people who were skilled where I was not. And, so a separate individual for all the woodworking, a separate individual for the wheels. Somebody else did the springs, the company that did the basic mechanical aspects of it, led me to a fairly broad network of people, and some have now become friends. But one of those, very early on, when I decided I was going to do this, I wanted to make sure I had a home for it. I wasn't going to build this as a garage trophy for myself. I was building this for Canadians. And so I needed to make sure that I had a place for it. So I approached museums. The Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa was one, Science and Technology, or Ingenium in Ottawa, was another, and there were a couple other smaller ones that I considered. And they gave me the criteria that was needed to establish the benchmark build that was necessary to satisfy them to take it on as a part of their collection. In doing so, I discovered through the Canadian Automotive Museum that they had a list of corporate sponsors. And it just dawned on me when I looked at their list that, wait a minute, if they can get sponsorship, maybe they'd be interested in sponsoring a project like this. And so I began to take on another sort of segment of the overall project in fundraising. I set up a GoFundMe page for private donors and went after family and friends and anybody I knew. I blasted that out across social media. And, there's a lot of people in the vintage automobile club area that were happy to come on board. And I slowly began to get some progress with corporate sponsors. The first one being Haggerty Insurance.
Right.
And they have been absolutely spectacular with me. I mean, if there's one corporate sponsor I should highlight, it would be Haggerty. Not only did they help with the initial funding of the project, but they also hosted the unveiling of it at a place they have here in Burlington called Haggerty Garage and Social. So when we unveiled it in, I think it was April 2022, they completely opened their doors to their facility for us to bring in a crowd of, I think we had probably about 100, 150 people, and hosted it and catered it. And it was fantastic. And so once you establish a Haggerty and an eBay and a Canadian Tire as a couple of the examples in the space, you start to build some momentum in your fundraising activity, because other companies say, well, if they're involved, probably we should be too. I mean, fundraising is a tough slug, and we had lots of declines where I thought we should have gotten yeses. But as an example, the Ford Motor Company, even though there was an association with Henry Ford, declined us about 5 times. I kept on trying to find new angles to go after them. But
I'll take that up with them. Yeah, I'll talk to the Ford people about why.
Yeah, and General Motors, the same thing. We tried to build off the Sam McLaughlin relationship and hope that GM would come on board, and they did. Although I would say that both organizations helped to now fund the museum, so that's a win in one way or another. Yeah, so you build momentum from that, and the three levels of government. So it wasn't difficult to get Sherbrooke, the city of Sherbrooke, to come alongside. It's their story as well, and we've done a lot to help promote Sherbrooke with that story, including taking the tribute car back to Sherbrooke for a couple of days in August, I think, 2022, and then the Quebec government wasn't too difficult. They came on side fairly quickly. The federal government was a tough slug. It took probably 10 attempts after 10 rejections or 9 rejections to finally convince them that they should be funding us. And they did finally. Now, the interesting twist there is now that the Fossmobile is complete and sitting in the Canadian Automotive Museum, Heritage Canada has now funded what's called Exit the Horse exhibit. So the museum will be putting on this exhibit. In fact, it's already being exhibited in their museum, but it'll actually go on a Canadian-wide tour, with the Fossmobile being the lead point of interest or issue or item of interest as part of the tour.
That's amazing. I was going to ask, so when was the vehicle actually completed? When did the final product?
Well, there was sort of a two-stage completion. The anniversary of the car rolling out of the shop originally was April 1867. So 125 years later was April 2022. Right. So we pushed really hard to have it sufficiently enough ready to do this unveiling at Haggerty Garage and Social. We had it covered and draped in a black cloth, and we had the media there, and we had government officials there, and friends and family and sponsors. And, we pulled the cover. I had my granddaughters pull the cover off of it, and there it was. But it wasn't quite finished. So the next drop dead date for us was the Cobble Beach, Concours Elegance Cobble Beach invited us to have the Fossmobile there in the fall of 2022. So that was a very prestigious offering to us. Now, this car could not be judged under their guidelines because it was all replicated, nothing original, but they wanted it there to help tell the Canadian and the vintage car story of first. So that became a push date for us, and we got it completed, got it up to Cobble Beach, showed it off, won an award. Even though it couldn't be judged, they issued an award to us anyway, which had two parts to it. It acknowledged my grandfather's contribution to building a first Canadian combustion engine vehicle, but also for our efforts as Fossmobile Enterprises to help Canadians understand Canadian automotive history with the tribute car. And then from there, it was taken almost immediately to the Canadian Automotive Museum, and we had another sort of unveiling at the museum or a placement ceremony into the museum.
I mean, I love Cobble Beach. I've stayed there several times. It's not far from where I grew up, and we've stayed in that, in the hotel, in the whatever they call it there, the inn, I guess, several times. But I've never been to the auto show. I've been meaning to go, so maybe I'll try and do that this summer.
It's the best of the best. You don't get to see automobiles like that collectively in one area in Canada very, very often, and they do it up the right way. There's no question about it.
The question then, so the vehicle's done, you have the unveiling at the Haggerty event, you take it to Cobble Beach. Have you driven it? How does it drive?
Okay, so this is a fundamental question that has come up right from the get-go of the project, right through it until your question now. No, it does not drive.
It does not drive.
It does not drive. So when I mentioned the fact that I'd gone to the museums to seek the criteria necessary for it to be placed into museum, what had to be in place. Part of that criteria was it did not need to run. They didn't see it as being essential from their perspective. So then two other factors came into play in my consideration, although I was pressured by many, many people to get it to run at least once. You're dealing with a 125-year-old cast iron engine that we found, right? Right. Cast iron gets brittle as it ages, and if we have anything wrong in any of the setup, any of the torque aspects of it, right through to the differential, so all the chain drives and all these things that we have to custom make. If something went wrong in trying to start that engine, you would be potentially back to square one in relation to that particular part of the drivetrain. And that's the most expensive part of the entire project. So it became a risk tolerance I wasn't willing to take. I guess maybe like my grandfather, I avoid risk a little bit. And because at that time, or when a lot of those decisions were being made, my fundraising was only just getting off the ground. I just decided that it wasn't necessary. And as time went on, and social media put more pressure on me to, oh, you got to get it to go. I used to say, write me the check and we'll get it to go. And nobody came up with what I figured would be the necessary lift in
Right.
investment to really make sure that all of our measurements and specs from engine through to differential were exact to start it.
So now it lives in the Canadian Automotive Museum, but it is now going to go on tour, is what you're
Yeah, so
saying.
it's a static display, right? So
Right.
it can go in a parade, but it'll have to be on a flatbed.
Right. Right.
Uh, and yeah, so the federal government, Heritage Canada, has decided that this is worthy enough for Canadians to see. And so they've, through the Canadian Automotive Museum, they have sponsored this, what has been called now the Exit the Horse exhibit.
Brilliant.
So it won't just be the Fossmobile; it'll be some of the other cars that the museum has in its collection that are pre, let's say, probably 1910. Before you get into the brass era, some of those early cars, they have 3 or 4 of that vintage in their collection. And so these cars, and it'll depend on where we're going as to how many of them will make the trek. The museums that they're going to may or may not have space. For the Fossmobile, we have a fairly strict criteria in relation to transporting, to method of storage and display. We don't want it touched and climbed on. So I mean, they've got to meet certain criteria to be a point of interest.
Sure.
But the first one, I believe, will be this fall at the Canadian Transport Museum just outside of Windsor. We're, I think, on track in conversations with Ingenium and Science and Technology to have it up in Ottawa, which I'm looking forward to because that's where the Henry Seth Taylor car is, the first steam car that I mentioned earlier. So to have the two side by side, I think would be a fascinating display. In fact, I've tried to broker with both museums to have the Henry Seth Taylor car brought to the Oshawa Museum for that same reason. So Canadians can see both those cars sitting side by side. We were in conversations with the museum out in Edmonton, down in New Brunswick. And Sherbrooke, we took it to Sherbrooke in I think it was August 2022. It was one of their most successful rallies of gatherings of people in relation to tourism. They have a market in Sherbrooke called Marché de la Gare. It's the old train station has been converted into a market on weekends. And once a year in August, they have a theme that goes back to the early 1900s. These people dress up in the times, and they sometimes sell, some of the merchants will sell some of their product at prices that were typical of those times. So instead of, $10 for an apple, you can buy it for 5 cents. And so we took the Fossmobile down for that weekend. So it helped the market because we brought people to see the car, and the market helped us because the people were there to go to the market anyway. So we had a fantastic turnout. Sherbrooke has put a big play on through me and the family to have the car permanently displayed in Sherbrooke, but they don't really have a proper facility for it. So we've not done that. But there is a monument in Sherbrooke that was erected on the 100th anniversary. So I guess that would make it 1997. It was, 1987. No, 1997. It was, this monument was erected to tribute George Foote Foss and the Fossmobile. We as a family donated to it to have it erected. But it's been taken down because there's some bridge construction going on, a brand new bridge in the area. It was going to run right over the top of the monument. So it's been in storage. There's been a promise by the city that once the parkland around the new bridge is developed, that it'll be replaced and re-erected. And so we've agreed to take the Fossmobile back to Sherbrooke for that re-erection ceremony of the monument. And I'm looking forward to that because, you can go anywhere in Canada with this story and there's genuine interest. There's no question about it. In Sherbrooke, it's heightened interest because it's their story. It's part of their city heritage as well. So the enthusiasm of the people who come to talk to you about it is overwhelmingly positive.
When I think about the Fossmobile and your story, your grandfather's story, I mean, it's reminiscent of so many Canadian innovations and the stories around them. Like you think of, my brain very quickly goes to, the Avro Arrow or the, even the Brooklyn, not a necessarily Canadian vehicle, but still manufactured in Canada, and, Nortel and BlackBerry. Like, we have this history of these amazing innovations that, maybe they exist for a while, but they don't stand the test of time. Do you count yourself among those? Do you think about it that way?
No, not to that level. I mean, those names that you rattled off, and I could name a few others like Manic,
Sure.
the Manic GT down from Granby in the automotive sector. They went on to have something that was commercially viable. They had some element of success. There was more than one, but for me, the importance as Canadians, we don't celebrate our successes very well, and to have built something as a first in Canada. And you could argue it predates Ford. I mean, Ford built the quadricycle, but it was a quadricycle. It wasn't a car per se, or at least that's how it got classified. And you talk to historians, and that debate gets pretty hot pretty fast. But you know, he did something that no others had done in Canada successful. And to me, to have that dismissed or forgotten about or buried didn't sit well with me. And so when I took on the project, I felt that we really needed to make this a Canadian story. And we've had a tremendous coverage. We've been published, I think, 60 or 65 times or more. We've been on all the major TV networks once or twice, and maybe a couple more times than that, depending on the location. We've been on radio. We received some awards, so clearly we've made the mark we wanted to make, but not to the extent or not to the class that you're talking about, I don't think.
Well, we'll see if we can change that. My last question, because I read this article just a little while ago in I think it was Wired magazine, and it talked about granddaughter of John DeLorean, and how she has this vision. She has a vision of creating her own car company. However, she doesn't own the name DeLorean. Like, she doesn't, it's actually a trademark that's now owned by someone else, and there's a different company, and that company already exists. And so it's this kind of strange phenomena of she can't pursue what she thinks or sees as her own legacy because she doesn't own her own name.
Right.
You own your own name. Have you ever thought about lending it to if someone were to write the right check, lending it to a new automobile company that wanted to, build a company? But I don't have this money, by the way, Ron. This isn't a pitch, just in case we're curious. But if someone were wanting to, do something similar, build a car company based in Canada, similar innovations built on the history of the Foss legacy and story, is that something you might entertain? Or in your mind, is building the Fossmobile and getting it into the Canadian Automotive Museum, or possibly someday, ideally, into a facility in Sherbrooke, where the story ends?
Well, I haven't given it a lot of thought, so your question's kind of intriguing. I mean, anybody who wants to write me a check, I'm happy to probably take it. But I think if there was an element of continuing on the legacy in some way, so let's just let's say GM wanted to create a line or a vehicle titled or called the Fossmobile. I certainly would be open to that, because it would be a way of continuing the name on in the automotive sector. But I really think that this story really has the two parts to it: the initial history, the initial building, what he did with it. It was also probably one of the first commercial vehicles, because he used it to help run his bicycle repair and machine shop, running around this town of Sherbrooke. It just has so many novel little pieces to it that has to remain part of the initial history. And then what I did with it was simply to extend that, or to give that, shed some light on that in a way that would be important for the family's legacy. Out beyond that, it's certainly not important to me. What's important to me is that we can continue to give it that light, to get Canadians to see it, to get people to the museum, to get it out on display at some of these specialty events, so that it can really get the appreciation that I think it deserves. And then, we are still, not sitting on our laurels, but we're still trying to get recognition. So I've been after Canada Post to issue a stamp. Now, interesting enough, there was a stamp for the Henry Seth Taylor car. There was a stamp for the first electric car, but there's never been a stamp for the first combustion car.
Huh.
And to this date, they continue to decline us. Same thing with the Canadian Mint, although they haven't fully declined us. So we apparently remain on a list of maybes or possibilities. And I've given them lots of ideas and marketing ways of potentially producing a coin in some way, whether it's a silver dollar or a gold coin or whatever. And again, the Henry Seth Taylor and the electric car have all been on coins, but we can't get the combustion engine on a coin. So, we try to pursue these things. My grandfather's name, the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, submitted an application to Heritage Canada to have George Foote Foss as a Canadian name of historical significance. That's been declined. So we've appealed that, and it's being re-reviewed. So they're at least willing to re-review. We as a family have provided more information than the Heritage Network was able to. So we're hoping or have our fingers crossed that they'll come around. When I look at the list of names of people who have been granted that designation throughout Canada, I would never take anything away from any of them, but their accomplishments, in my view, were lesser than developing the first Canadian combustion engine automobile.
Right.
And so we hope that they'll come through with that. So those kinds of recognitions to me are far more important than what you talked about or the idea that you had. None of them require a check in our favor, but it would be the recognition that I think my grandfather is deserving of is to if I could get a stamp, a coin, and his name recognized as part of our Canadian heritage, I would be very happy.
That's wonderful. I mean, I love this story. I want to thank you for the time and indulging me in my questions today. Let's see what we can do. Let's get this podcast complete, and let's see if we can get the word out further about George Foss and the Fossmobile.
Appreciate it, Matthew. Thank you. And any opportunity we have to try to get the story out, we jump on it. So I appreciate your effort and time.
And there it is. There we have it. It would be great if we could get the Fossmobile on a coin or a stamp. Man, that would be great. I don't know how we do that. Does anyone know how we do that? Reach out if you know how we can do that. If you happen to work at the Mint or Canada Post, reach out and I'll put you in touch with Ron and we can figure this stuff out. If you want to see the Fossmobile, it is still in the Exit the Horse exhibit at the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa. So you can see that there. That exhibit continues until October 31st, 2024. But then I think the Fossmobile will probably be there for a little while longer. So it's probably until it can have a better home in Sherbrooke. It sounds like its current home is the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa. As always, I want to thank you for listening. If you are interested in automotive and you want to learn more about some of the other stuff that I do and talk about, please sign up for my newsletter at growdy.wtf, growdy.wtf. And also, as always, I want to thank Dark Tapes for supplying the music for my podcast. Have a great week, everyone. Until next time.